Welcome to Reading the Bible Together, and today we're reading Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel story. Now, we covered this quite a bit in a sermon of a few weeks ago, and much of the material today is taken from that same sermon. So it might sound familiar to you, but it's such a great story, it's well worth looking at it again. Because the Tower of Babel is one of the great Old Testament stories. It's a parable of human arrogance and pride, a warning against the abuses of technology, a cautionary tale of dangers in the life of the city, and yet one more example of humanity's attempt to replace God with themselves. But it's also a parable to which we need to pay attention. The result of the tower plagues us to this very day. Now, I call it not just a story, but a parable, because it does what Jesus so often and so memorably does. And that's to take a situation that's familiar to everyone, the dangers of traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, for instance, introduces a cast of characters. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, we've got a traveler, a robber, some religious folks, a Samaritan, and then Jesus brings it all together in a story which tells us something important about ourselves and our world and God. Now, in calling it a parable, this Tower of Babel, it also brings out from a single moment of history a timeless lesson from which we can learn. So, for instance, the parable of the Good Samaritan is not whether or not that particular event actually took place. The point is, that kind of thing, a man robbed and beaten with seemingly good people doing nothing to help, or in other parables, a son unwisely blowing his inheritance, or a dishonest manager caught with his hand in the till, that kind of thing happens all the time. What Jesus does with a parable is to derive from those occurrences an insight into humanity, our world, and God. The story is just not told for its own sake. It's told for the sake of the truths that are also derived from it. Jesus turns a story, an event, no matter how commonplace or rare, into a timeless truth which remains true long after the story and the event it describes are gone. And the Tower of Babel is a parable based upon the greatest city of the ancient world, Babylon, and the ziggurat, or the pyramidal stepped temple constructed at its center. Babylon was a place. The ziggurat was constructed. But while both the city and the temple have now for long millennia lay in ruins, the truth of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel and the lessons and consequences derived from it live on. So in looking a little more closely at the story, we find a couple of things that we might otherwise miss. First of all, we're told of a single language uniting all people. Now, one of the central truths of Scripture is that all of humanity is derived from a single source. We're all related. And while the Bible is very familiar about ethnicity, that there are those with different backgrounds, cultures, languages, skin color, it completely rejects the idea of race in the way that we understand it today. For instance, skin color is rarely mentioned in the Old Testament, and never even then in a derogatory sense. Not once is skin color mentioned in the New. It was never seen as something which separated one person from another, other than giving a clue about their country of origin. You go back far enough, says the Bible, we all end up in the same place. Go back far enough, we all have the same mom and dad. And the common language of the story of the Tower of Babel is a sign of that. Now notice also that the story tells us that as people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Now, we just blow right over that, but it's actually the first sign of a substantial problem. The plain of Shinar, which is located between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, is not far from where the Bible places the Garden of Eden. God's command to humanity right after be fruitful and multiply is to spread over all the earth. After the Noah event, when the story of humanity is given a fresh start, the command is reiterated to Noah and his sons. Be fruitful, increase in number, spread out, and fill the earth. Now, not surprisingly, they get the be fruitful part right. But the Babel story tells us they got the second part wrong. Rather than spreading through the earth, they actually don't get very far before they say, well, far enough, let's stop right here and build a city. Now, the Bible isn't fond of cities. The first city, we're told, was founded by Cain, the murderer of his brother Abel. That's not a great start. Remember that Abraham's nephew Lot settled in Sodom and Gomorrah, which were cities famous for questionable morality and a brutal lack of hospitality. Babylon, where our story was set, is infamous as the seat of pagan idolatry and heartless military expansionism. It was Babylon which would later utterly destroy Jerusalem. It was Babylon which provided the bloodthirsty false gods of Baal and Astarte and Molech, to which the Israelites were so often fatally drawn. Nothing good comes out of cities, is the Old Testament's opinion. Put enough people too close together and bad things happen, which is what happens in Babel. Here we are introduced to the first bit of humor in the story. The Babylonians, employing spiffy new technology, build with brick made with mud rather than build with stone. Now, if you go to Israel, where stone was used for construction, you can find buildings thousands of years old. Many are still standing. You go to Babylon, and the brick buildings have largely returned to the mud with which they were made. Man-made materials rather than natural materials are a problem right off the bat. The problems with building materials multiply as the bricks, we are told, are glued together with tar rather than joined with proper mortar. So with any kind of an earthquake, a building that's glued together is going to crumble and collapse immediately. There's no ability to shift and move. The project is doomed from the start. But human arrogance is not limited to the use of building technology. They decide to employ their concentrated numbers and high-tech economy to challenge even the heavens. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. We reject God's plan, says the Babylonians. We will not be scattered. We make the rules. We are the important ones. It is our name rather than the name of God which will endure. And now another moment of humor in the dark story. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. This was the tower that would pierce the very heavens, and challenge the God of heaven. But God had to come way down just to see it. What's that there? Is that a tower? The tower was too small to see from heaven. The hubris of man, so great in man's own eyes, could not even be seen from heaven. Well, we've reversed this in our own time. Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, famously looked out his capsule window in low Earth orbit and is said to declare, "I see no God up here." An ant climbs from his hole, stands upon the highest tip of the anthill and says, "I see no God up here." Yet we persist in believing, Babel-like, that with our pride in technology, we can declare that we are masters of the heavens, that our instruments can somehow detect God, or more commonly in our parlance today, can detect that there is no God. That's not the Bible's view. The Lord had to come way down to see the city and the tower the people were building. Now, the Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. Well, that's a bit puzzling. How is it that this ridiculous tower project is a threat in any way to God? Well, like a parent discovering a group of rebellious teens up to no good, they're told to scatter. Those kids are not to communicate with one another any longer. They're not permitted to text one another or email or gather in internet chat rooms. Their Twitter accounts are suspended. They are blocked from using Facebook and Instagram. I may be drifting into political territory here. In the biblical parlance, in the ancient version of shutting down their social media contact, the language is confused and they are scattered. Not because they threatened heaven. Once again, we're told the Lord had to go way down to initiate this confusion. No, they didn't threaten heaven, but in their vain abuse of power and technology, they threatened themselves. And so they're cursed with confusion, with the failure to understand one another. And not only does the project die, not only does the great city and the mud brick tower fall into ruin, The confusion and failure to understand one another or even listen to one another plagues humanity to this very day. And if what we read in the paper and watch on the news is any indication, the failure to listen to one another, the failure to understand one another gets worse every year. We are still living in a Tower of Babel age. But the solution to the division and confusion is set in motion at the end of this very chapter. After another genealogy, this one of Shem, Noah's eldest son. Maybe you remember that Shem's brother Ham had been under a bit of a cloud. He's designated as the ancestor of the Canaanite people, whom the Hebrews will displace to claim the promised land. Japheth is noticed as the ancestor of the coastal seafaring folk, out of which the Philistines will arise, another traditional enemy of the Hebrews. That leaves our man Shem. And the important name here in this Shem genealogy is one that comes at the very last line. That's when we read about Abram, who was to become Abraham, out of whom God would raise a new people, a people to follow God's way to be a blessing to all the world. But for Abraham's story, we'll wait until next time. We'll see you then.